Hey, hello everybody, it's Daryl here, and I just got back from a bike ride. And I've said this in other videos, I like to think I do my best thinking when I'm exercising, but it's specifically bike riding because it gets the blood pumping so much. It goes, the blood pumps the brain, and there's been studies where it actually says, exercising and stuff like that improves your cognitive thinking. And I really, beyond a death shadow of a doubt, I believe it's true. And I got this idea. And I can't find any flaw in it. I went for a bike ride for an hour and a half, and I was thinking about this the whole time. And I challenge anybody to come up with a flaw again, to find a fault in this. I believe the game of Monopoly is the perfect example of why capitalism is ultimately a completely flawed system. And Elon Musk, it's going to get to a tipping point, where one person has so much wealth that there'd be no other way but for that one person to then accumulate all wealth on earth, and then everybody else will be more or less broke or indentured servants to that one person. I think it'll hit a tipping point. This is one thing that crossed my mind. Okay, Elon Musk, there's numbers thrown around that he has $300 billion. And I've written that number out. I want you to write that number out. I think there's 12 zeros? It is a freaking huge number. I don't think most people understand how big 300 billion is. Or I think a lot of people don't even want to understand how big 300 billion is. And it started to occur to me, it's almost like a magnet, and it gets bigger and bigger. With each dollar, it gets exponentially bigger. With each dollar he gets, it earns him $5 more, and those $5, each one of those $5 earns him $100 more, and each one of those $100 earns him $1,000 more. But through investing, if you just put that whole 300 billion into a bank and collected interest, eventually he would suck up all the wealth in the world. Does that not make sense? Our system is hugely flawed. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not a capitalist or a socialist. I do believe in social democracy. But our system is hugely flawed. And I started thinking about the game Monopoly. And the game Monopoly is a perfect example of how our system eventually, because the game Monopoly is a much smaller system, eventually gets to the point where one person owns everything and everybody else loses or becomes impoverished, or indentured servants to the one owner. Their wealth sucks up all everybody else's wealth. And it started to click. That's Elon Musk. It is. And there's got to be a mathematical tipping point. When somebody accumulates a certain amount of wealth mathematically, there's just no way other than for the rest of the wealth to then be drawn into that one entity. You see what I mean? Exponentially, I think that once you get a certain amount, once a magnet gets so big, it will pull everything, all the other magnets around the world to it. With each magnet, it gets bigger and stronger. And I think it's the same way with money. And Monopoly is the perfect example. And I started to think it's the same way with being poor. When you're poor, there is no way of getting wealthy. The poorer you are, the poorer you get. And the richer you are, the richer you get, until it gets to an extreme where there's just one person that has all wealth and everybody else is indentured servants. And I started to think about that $200 you collect on Monopoly. And that is just a way to survive, because people have to have survived. People have to have some hope, to keep functioning, to keep this whole thing propped up. So they get $200 each time they pass go to pay to stay out of jail. It's a perfect example of our system. But they never get wealthy. They might own one or two properties, but eventually they will lose those properties because they'll land on Park Place one time and they'll lose everything. And eventually, that's just how the game works. And that's exactly how our capitalist system works. Eventually, I believe, if you really think it through, one billionaire is going to end up wiping out everybody else and sucking all the wealth up into one person. Just like the game of Monopoly. And it must have occurred to people like Elon Musk too. So it just, I believe that, with every dollar that a person like Elon Musk gets, that $1 earns $100 or $1,000 exponentially more. And each one of those $1,000 earns $10,000. You know what I mean? And it just gets huge until it gets to a mathematical tipping point where it just can't reverse. And eventually that one entity or person will suck up all the wealth in the game or in the system or in capitalism or in the country. That's where we're headed. Our system of capitalism in America is just a bigger board game of monopoly. And I believe this must have occurred to Elon Musk, that he's going to end up being the sole powerful entity, the one holder of all wealth, and all other people will be under him. It's a scary thought, but that's where it's headed. Think about it. And I got home. When I got home, I was like, I have to ask AI this. When I'm going to ask on my phone, I'm going to ask AI. I wanted to phrase it right. The first time I phrased it, I said, the big game of monopoly, isn't that a perfect example of how our system of capitalism is flawed? And it kind of danced around. It started explaining the rules of monopoly to me. So I backed up and I said it again. I said, is not Monopoly, the game of Monopoly, a perfect example demonstrating how the winner will collect all wealth in a system? I forgot how I phrased it. And I got AI. It's almost like AI didn't want to answer me. Like it almost like Elon Musk was on the other end of AI. It actually said this. It said, you have an interesting point there. AI actually told me that. It said, you bring up an interesting point. And it still danced around. It still got, it really didn't give me a solid answer. But, I'm no mathematical, I suck at math. But it just, your natural instinct, if you ever play Monopoly, I believe it gets to a tipping point once you buy up so many properties. And it's the same in real life. It's just played out on a much bigger board in our country over a much longer period of time. And I believe we're at that tipping point where the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And it just starts getting more extreme exponentially, where the wealth just keeps flowing in one direction to one entity. Eventually, now it's several, like they say, there's 9 billionaires, 9 people own the majority of wealth of the whole country or something like that. That's where it's all headed. And eventually it'll be one, it's the only end result possible. Just like the game of Monopoly. Tell me I'm wrong. Let me know what you think. Have a good day.